Hello, everybody. So early. That's painfully early. I feel like I'm still dreaming. How was the weekend? Pretty good. I guess in addition to the early, it's not only early, it's also cold. You guys notice that? It is better. Yeah, it's a crazy day. I don't know what is going on. It's cold. It's early. It's windy. It's like below 30 degrees outside, or at least it was when I left. So yeah, I don't know what's going on. I had a brisk walk, so I'm kind of warm, but maybe I will regret rolling up my sleeves in a moment. How's everybody doing in the chat? How was the weekend? No comments from the chat?
Good, thank you.
All right. Good is good. Is okay. Busy? Good morning, good morning. What were you busy doing, Cameron? Ellie's busy. Everybody's busy. What are we busy with?
Well, oh, well, I have exams, like we have midterms going on. So I've been studying for my tax one that I have on Tuesday, well, tomorrow, and my family and stuff like that. And I had a birthday in the family, so we had my dad's, and then so we went out for like a small dinner and stuff. So I've just been kind of busy here and there.
Okay, that sounds like a kind of a delightful weekend. It sounds like a real weekend in a way, right? Like you have to do some things. As maybe you can tell from my comment, I also had a busy weekend, but it was not quite as delightful. 2 midterms today. Okay, I thought the midterms were over, but I guess they're still rolling on. Our midterm feels like a long time ago, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, good luck, everybody. You can do it. There's a nice phrase in Chinese, which is 加油, which literally means add oil. But it means like, let's go. So go get them, everybody. Jayo. In our class, you don't have to jayo. Actually, today is about meditation. So today we can like do the opposite of jayo, which is we can kind of chill. So hopefully, well, I guess we'll get to the meditation in a moment. Maybe to just begin with, like we usually do, we can do a little review. So we did lots of intense philosophy stuff last time. And again, today we'll move into meditation, but I think we can put a cap on this like we usually do. Again, what is middle way philosophy? It takes the same idea of the middle way, right? We've talked about the middle way a lot, but it kind of redefines it, right? So again, we have two extremes, but instead of asceticism and indulgence, now we have two other extremes that we are navigating between. So what are the two extremes? I have it here. Yeah, midway between existence and non-existence, right? Remember I wrote up on the board, we had existence. I think I called it absolutism because I want to give it an ism, but you could just think of it as existence and non-existence. The idea like things just sort of are the way they appear to be, and the other side is nothing is real and everything is an illusion, right? And the Buddhists want to say, actually, it's something kind of in between. I watched something on Netflix recently that sort of made me think about these topics. Did you see the thing about Mormons blowing each other up with bombs? It's pretty disturbing in a way. You know, when I say that out loud. So I won't ruin it for you. It's like a 3-part series. It's one of these like, you know, kind of dragged out Netflix shows where it's like you probably could have done that in an hour, but they made it 3 hours or however long it is. And anyways, I bring it up because it plays with this idea of kind of truth and belief, right? Well, I think if I go into any more detail than that, I'd probably ruin it for you. So maybe I'll just stop there. But you know, if you start to investigate, you know, all the things that we hold as real, for example, I don't know, something as fundamental as like your identity as a member of your family, for example, right? You know, I don't want to pop any bubbles, but let's say my parents adopted me. This is also kind of a mean joke that parents sometimes play on children. Maybe you've heard of this before, but they tell a child that they were adopted, right? We found you by a trash can. Has anybody ever been told that before? Anyway, so let's suppose that is true. My parents found me by a trash can, adopted me, raised me as their son. Maybe I'm not their biological son, right? In my mind, I'm still their son. But the day could come where I realize that I was just found by a trash can. My real parents are out there somewhere else, right? My real family is somewhere else. And so these things we hold as real, these things we hold as ourselves, our identity, can be a bit more fragile than they sometimes appear. You guys follow me so far? And so that's what this existence and non-existence duality is sort of playing with, right? We can oscillate between, oh yes, I am my parents' son, I am who I think I am a Jasper, I'm a New Yorker, I'm whatever it is that I am. But all of that can change, right? And so it's easy to jump to the other side and think, okay, I'm none of those things. Maybe I'm just nothing. Nothing exists. Nothing's real. And then you sort of have a breakdown. And so it's easy to oscillate between these two things. And I would argue that's how we usually live. We're either stuck in this mode where it's just like, yes, things are real. Yes, this is how stuff is. Yes, I believe in this and that. And then sometimes you jump to this other side and all of a sudden you're looking at a QAnon website and nothing is real anymore, right? You guys know about QAnon? Yeah, so I'd argue that's part of this conversation too. You know, your conspiracy theory loving uncle, everybody has one. I know I do. Who's reminding us that nothing is real, right? Whereas he's not wrong in saying that. You know, a lot of the things we hold as true actually are a little more loose than they seem to be. So there's some truth to that. But I think the more interesting place is actually somewhere in the middle, right? Where you're less surprised when these untruths show up, but you're also able to still sort of function in polite society. So that's this middle way we're talking about. One way to express that is emptiness. Remember emptiness? That's a key term. Really important word in Buddhism. In Sanskrit, it's called shunyata. You don't have to know that. But it just refers to this absence of this seeming existence, right? So your identity as a family member, as a Jasper, as even a person is kind of empty. When you investigate it, where is my Jasperness, right? Maybe it's on my ID card, but of course the ID card was just made in the basement in Thomas Hall or whatever. You know, if you look for what really makes me a Jasper, I would argue you won't be able to find it. You're just a Jasper because people tell you you're a Jasper. You're a Jasper because you wear your green shirt or whatever. But again, take away the green shirt and where is your Jasperness, right? It's hard to find. So that's what emptiness is referring to, is this kind of dissolution of our usual way of looking at the world. It's not all the way to nothing, right? But it's moving in that direction. Now, the other side of this is what we finished last class with, and that's kind of moving in the other way, right? If you tend to already be on this side of things, the QAnon side of things, let's say, where nothing is real and everything's a lie, and you get sort of trapped in this world of nihilism, right? Which is what I called it last time. This is another good word. Nihilism, nothingism, right? If you get trapped, and I would argue QAnon is basically a cult of nihilism, because again, it's denying any sort of substantial reality. Everything's a lie. You're all sheeple. Actually, I saw outside of my office, somebody had written something about sheeple. I was amazed, right? I didn't know, like, it's the faculty hallway on the 4th floor of Memorial Hall. Like, students don't usually come up there. So either we have, frankly, an insane faculty member who's writing about sheeple, or some student ran up there and wanted to tell the faculty that they're sheeple. But either way, somebody's telling someone that they're sheeple. And so again, that's this sort of non-existent side of things, right? Saying nothing exists, nothing's real. It's all a great big conspiracy. What's really real is what the internet told me. That's what's really real. And so what Buddha Nature is trying to do is, rather than build up a QAnon conspiracy, it's trying to build up enlightenment, basically, right? Rather than living in a world where everybody's trying to get you and everything is horrible and everything is suffering, right? We've seen a lot of suffering. We've seen a lot of reminders that you can kind of game the karma system and get a better rebirth, get some merit, and do all that sort of good stuff. This really rewrites the script, this idea of Buddha Nature. It feels kind of simple, right? We just talked about a bunch of metaphors last time, but it just utterly transforms Buddhist philosophy and practice. Come on in, come on in. So anyways, we finished with Buddha Nature last time. We didn't quite go through all of the metaphors, but here are some of them. Do you guys want to go over any of these again? I know we ran out of time last time, but we did some breakout rooms and we talked about these. What do some of these metaphors refer to? Can anybody remember? Let's get the wheels turning. What were these metaphors talking about? Okay. Okay, so if you couldn't hear, Sydney said it's something good wrapped in something bad, and it's a metaphor that's saying enlightenment is already here inside of you. So again, very simple concept on the face of it, right? I think Sydney explained it very nicely. If you read the sutra, you might think, okay, like this is getting a little repetitive, like what's the point here? But again, if you take it to heart, it really transforms this just the entire Buddhist enterprise. And so we're going to return to this. This is more like an introduction to the idea of Buddha nature. And we're going to see how this plays out in particularly East Asian Buddhism. So for example, we'll read a book about Zen Buddhism at the end of the semester. And this is just so utterly important for Zen. And as we talk about meditation, we can begin to think, how does this transform meditation, right? Because there are many different ways to meditate. So we're going to get to all of that in a bit. Any specific metaphors you want to go over? Do you guys feel pretty good about these? If I gave you an exam and I quoted about one of these metaphors, would you be able to recognize it? Yeah? Because again, that's a good way to think, right? It's like if I saw, let's say, a quote like, it is like a store of treasure inside the house of an impoverished man. There's a great treasure in the bodies that is eternal and unchanging. If you saw a quotation like that, would you be able to say, aha, Buddha nature? Would you be able to make that connection? Because again, it's this very good thing, like Sydney was saying, hidden, concealed, wrapped up, right? And in this case, it's something that the person really needs and really wants. And it's right next to him. It's just under the floor. It's just right there, right? But he doesn't know it's there. Okay, I don't want to push this too hard. It sounds like you guys pretty much got it. So unless there are other questions, we can move on. Questions? All right, let's move on. Now, again, I'm making big promises. I'm saying this totally transforms the Buddhist landscape. But one thing you might be wondering is there a practice associated with these metaphors? Because again, it's sort of like, all right, cool story, bro. Really nice metaphors. But what is the practice? What do you think? How does this affect Buddhist practice? Can you think of anything? So, for example, I brought up meditation a moment ago. Could you imagine a meditation based on this new concept of Buddha nature? What would that look like? I know you are probably new at meditation, but theoretically, we have read Kyon's chapter 7 on meditation, so we know a little bit about it now. What would Buddha nature meditation look like? What do you think? Okay. Again, that's maybe I'm trying to ask you to make a leap that is not easy to make. There's nothing in the Tathagata Sutra that talks about meditation, except actually there's one line that I think I have on the next slide where it tells you not to do meditation. If you exert yourselves, and do not spend a lot of time sitting in the meditation hall, you will attain the path of the very highest realization and save limitless being. So we've got this language of saving beings. Is that familiar? Yes. I need some nods of affirmation, because if not, we can back up. What does that make you think of? Saving limitless beings. Have we talked about that before? Saving beings? Who wants to save beings? Okay, very good. So if you couldn't hear, Buddha's vow. What is the name of someone who takes this vow? It is on the path to enlightenment. Remember, I drew the up and down chart for you guys the one time? Bodhisattva vow. Very good. And so we're talking about the greater vehicle, remember? Where Bodhisattva vow, Bodhisattva path is open to everybody, right? And so that's one thing that this is doing. Is rather than just the Buddha having access to enlightenment, all of a sudden everybody does. Everybody has this. That's another way that the game changes. is everybody has this potential for enlightenment. So there's a sense that we can save limitless beings. This again is the goal of the bodhisattva. Remember, we had the low-level bodhisattvas who take the vow, just like RELS is saying. Then we had the high-level ones, almost Buddhas, right? And so this is something that they would want to be able to do. And of course, other bodhisattvas would want to be able to do too. And so it's saying that you should exert yourself, but it's not really saying how you should do it, right? And so again, maybe this is less interesting to you, but we can learn a lot about the history of Buddhism here. Let me find it. On 102, yeah, there it is. There's this talk of how you should accept, recite, copy, revere, and widely expound this Tathagata Sutra for the benefit of others. Again, it's a little bit veiled, but what this is introducing is we have these books, right? And with this greater vehicle of Buddhism, these books become more and more important. And what the practice really becomes is copying these books, because you got to sort of take a step back in time. Did they have like, you know, a printer that they had access to back in the day? If let's say Jocelyn has this really cool book, and she's a monk or she's a nun and I'm a monk, and I really want that book, what do I have to do in order to get the book from Jocelyn? I have to copy it by hand, the entire thing. And so this becomes a form of Buddhist practice. It might sound a little mundane. It might sound a little like, oh, what a waste of time, but it becomes the central practice, particularly of this kind of Buddhism. So what is the practice of this sutra? We have all these metaphors and this sort of thing. It's basically writing the sutra over again. It becomes this cult of the book, is what one scholar calls it. So these books come out and they say, I am the best book. The book kind of promotes itself. It's almost like they add some sort of marketing and branding to it. And this goes on where it says, there's this really long ... that I break it off here, but it's basically the virtues will derive from doing these activities. Reciting and copying the scripture would be, and I won't read the whole thing, but it's like, if you're working really diligently, cultivating spiritual powers, blah, 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 and it keeps going. And saying doing all those things would still not be equal to those who find joy and enlightenment in the Tathagata Sutra, who accepts it, recites it, copies it, or even reveres but a single one of its metaphors. So it's also promising this vast merit. This is also part of the greater vehicle, right? Whereas earlier Buddhist texts are basically like philosophical ideas coming from the Buddha. Here we have these books promoting themselves and saying, if you copy this book, then you will get unlimited merit, basically. Unimaginable amounts of merit. So that's how it closes, is basically these instructions for people to copy books. Again, maybe that feels a little bit strange, but at the same time, it helps us explain how all these books get so widely disseminated and how we have them today, right? Because again, if each book has to be copied by hand, that's a lot of work, right? And so it becomes a part of the practice. And then as people copy these books, they go out and tell their friends, they spread the books around, and again, Buddhism grows, right? So this is one way in which it grows. So as we think about what is the practice associated with this work, it actually tells us what it wants you to do is to copy and recite the scripture. If you're able to read and write, copy it. If you're not able to, then you can just recite it. Okay, so maybe that's enough. Any questions about all this? I just wanted to bring your attention to sort of the closing section. If there are no questions, let's talk about meditation. So this is, now we're back to Kyon. Maybe you notice we sort of alternate. We get like a little primary source reading, right, where we go into some detail. Now we're kind of back into the more analytical stuff. Has anybody meditated before? Meditation, yeah? Why do people meditate? What does it do for you? And so maybe that's why the question I asked you a little while ago was confusing, right? Is what would a Buddha nature meditation look like? Because first of all, Jocelyn is exactly right. If you can hear her, she talked about it's clearing your mind. Maybe it helps you relax, right? Do you guys know the word mindfulness? Have you heard of mindfulness before? So that's a very common type of meditation, but it's, in fact, it's only one type. So that's one thing maybe you didn't already know. If you did, then that's good. But if you didn't, then you will see this week is that there are actually many different kinds of meditation, and mindfulness is just one. So Jocelyn's absolutely right, and she described what you are trying to do in this particular form of meditation, but there are actually lots of different meditations. The definition that Kyung gives us is pretty good. An altered state of consciousness which is introduced in a controlled manner. So there are kind of two parts to this definition, right? Altered state of consciousness. Have you guys ever had an altered state of consciousness before? What does that make you think of? Drugs. Yeah. Yeah, and meditation. And so if I only read this definition and not the rest of the chapter, I would almost think like, okay, this is a way I could get high without having to do drugs. And in fact, that's kind of how meditation came to America. I hate to put it so crudely, but back in like the 50s and 60s, right, when drugs were sort of becoming more and more interesting to people, sort of the hippie, it was like the beatniks in the 50s and then the hippies in the 60s. They're the ones who really started to get interested in meditation. And I think one reason is people began to recognize that to quote, what's his name, Mr. Mackey on South Park, that drugs are bad, right? That they're bad for you, they're bad for your health. And people like this way of altering their consciousness. They like to sort of, again, if we have this existence, non-existence duality, right? Drugs kind of play with that. They kind of bring you into this middle space. I think people were excited by it, and yet they also maybe didn't want to endanger their health and make bad decisions and then end up arrested or even worse, right? And so people started to turn to meditation as a way to kind of achieve that same sort of experience. But again, the second part, in a controlled manner. Now, I would argue that that's not the only way to think about meditation, right? If you go to most places in the world and start talking about like doing drugs and meditating, especially with monks or something like that, they look at you like you're a crazy person, right? It's like, why would you ever do that? What are you talking about? There maybe, throughout history, a lot of my research is more historical. There are some parallels to this. And in modern day India, for example, there's some kind of holy men who smoke a lot of weed and meditate kind of outside of society. So it is a thing. But I would argue sort of a modern thing, right? I don't think there are a ton of examples of this that I can think of, right? Okay, so if we think about how did meditation come to America, this is one way. It's not the only way, too. Even like further back, like 100 years ago, there were different Christian groups that were sort of interested in focusing on the mind as opposed to the body, right? People saw the flesh as sort of a problem. It's kind of a Christian thing. You want to focus on your spirit, and that became equated with the mind. And so meditation appealed to religious groups as well. Even before the life of the Buddha, people were meditating, right? And so it's not like the Buddha invented it or something. He did kind of come up with a particular kind of meditation, which we'll talk about in a moment. But even before the life of the Buddha, people were doing yoga, people were doing what we might call concentration meditation, where they were doing that same sort of thing, just like Christians were in America 100 years ago, is focusing on the spirit, right? Trying to find your soul as opposed to your flesh, right? Because, your body's going to die one day. And the Buddha was disturbed by that, and he wasn't the only one disturbed by that, right? He had all those friends who were meditating in the woods. They were also disturbed by that. So how do you solve that problem? Is you find your soul, your immortal soul, and your immortal soul will not die. It will reincarnate. And so if you meditate on your soul, you will find a way to transcend our usual existence, right? Now, the Buddha kind of critiques this, right? If we go back to this existence, non-existence thing, this idea of a soul would be pretty far on the existence side, wouldn't it? So this is the Buddha's big critique, is to kind of reel in this idea of a soul or a self with a capital S. So anyways, that's sort of a Hindu doctrine that he's responding to. We're not going to get into that, but I think in order to understand this early meditation, you sort of have to understand that. So just a little background on mindfulness, what it is, where it comes from, before we get into more Buddhist kind of historical stuff. Maybe it's worth spending a little bit of time just understanding what is mindfulness. There's a famous practice called MBSR. Has anybody heard of this before? MBSR? No? So mindfulness-based stress reduction. This is basically like a secularized meditation. It's basically taking what I would call Buddhist meditation and sort of stripping away anything that feels religious, right? And it was done on purpose. People attribute it to this guy, John Kabat-Zinn, and I have no reason to say otherwise. I think he kind of coined the phrase MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction. He's not the only one who was doing this sort of practice, right? You could see why there would be an interest. If meditation existed before Buddhism, it's been across many different many different religious traditions, including Christianity, right? There's sort of the Gnostic movements, the desert fathers from 2,000 years ago who were hanging out, meditating in the desert. So meditation is sort of all over the place. So why not adapt it for our modern world, right? And that's really what this project was all about. And a lot of it comes down to stress too. You guys ever feel stressed out? Of course, I feel stressed out too. And anxiety is, I don't have it on the slide, but anxiety is another issue, right? We feel anxious, we feel stressed out, we feel overworked. And particularly in pandemic times, right? There's just this extra layer. We were chatting this morning about how it's so early, it's so cold, I'm so tired, right? I was walking down the hill on the way to school today. I was thinking about all of these different stresses and different things sort of coalescing in life all at once. I just started laughing. I couldn't help sort of see how absurdly ridiculous this particular morning is. It's all these different things all coming together, all in this very moment. It just felt sort of like an absurd moment. I couldn't help but laugh out loud. And so that's kind of where mindfulness comes in, right? Is it allows you to take all these stresses in life and gives you at least one tool to deal with them, right? Which is basically to take a step back and kind of look at all of these different things. And again, maybe sort of laugh at them. You don't have to laugh at them, but at least observe them and not necessarily get pushed and pulled and tossed around by them. So why don't we give it a try? I discovered, let's say, this group called Headspace. You guys know who Headspace is? They have a Netflix show that just came out this past winter. And I saw it and I was thinking of just showing you that, but then I realized I think copyright might be weird if I tried to show it over Zoom. I've never tried to do it before. So I'm not doing the Netflix one, but there are like little kind of tastes of Headspace from YouTube that I found. So there's a shorter one and there's a longer one. You guys want to do the shorter one or the longer one? 5 minutes or 10 minutes? 10 minutes is kind of long, but that's how you really get into it. If you only do 5 minutes, you'll get a taste, but it's not like a real meditation. What would you prefer? I don't want to force you to do a 10-minute meditation and you'd be hating it the whole time. 5 minutes or 10? How adventurous are we feeling? Chat? How do you do? Can I do a poll? I've never done a poll before. I'll just go like this: 5 or 10. Is there a way to do a poll? I've heard of these things. I don't know. I'll have to investigate that. Yeah, let's see it. Nobody's giving any response. What do you guys think? Well, 10? Okay, that's what I'm talking about. You guys give it 10? Okay, let's do 10. All right, let me do this then. Okay, everybody's going 10. 10 out of 10 for 10.
So taking.
All right. Now, one thing I want to say is that this is a British guy named Andy. What is his name? It's something a little ridiculous. I don't know. Does it say in the notes here? I don't think it does. He's a British guy, though. He has a very soothing voice. Do they tell us? Anyways, his first name is Andy. I remember that. And again, this is that sort of stripped down, secularized form of meditation. So obviously, if you don't want to do this, you don't have to. You can just take 10 minutes to kind of chill. But I do encourage you to at least pay attention to what he's asking you to do, right? And think about what's the point, right? So as you can see, the title is Stress to Meditation to Reframe Stressful Situations. And so this is designed to help you with stress. And so I encourage you to think, well, first of all, does it, right? And second of all, how would it, right? How would this help me with stress? So let's give it a try. I'm going to stop the recorder just because to social media, that's an effective approach because you can literally hit the mute button and turn it off. But when it comes to your mind, a lot of the time when you try to push stuff away, it actually ends up being more work than what Jocelyn ended up doing, right? Which is sort of, okay, the thoughts come, and then again, you can sort of take a step back from them and be like, oh, here comes a thought. Interesting. What is this thought about? Laundry. Huh. Laundry's interesting. All right, well, see you later, laundry. And so rather than sort of following after the thought and pushing it away and say, I don't want to think about you right now, get out of here, laundry, right? You can just sort of notice it. Andy used the language of label it, right? Say, oh, that's a thought. And then after you've labeled it, then there is a way in which it kind of disappears. It's one of the, I'd say, major takeaways from an exercise like this is that thoughts tend to think themselves, right? On the exam, I asked you, how do you act with your mind, right? And this is kind of helping us get some insight into that. Thoughts do tend to think themselves. So where does the action come in? The action comes in whether we decide to follow those thoughts or not, right? And again, this is still mental. This is still just a mental exercise. Do I mentally bring my awareness to that thought? Do I follow that thought? Do I explore that thought? Do I think more about laundry and how I have to top up my card in order to pay for both the laundry and the dryer and how much laundry detergent I have? Oh, maybe I need to get some next time I go to the store, right? Do I start exploring the details of laundry, or do I just kind of label it and let laundry go wherever it came from, right? Because again, especially with this idea of karma, we tend to think the thoughts that we tend to think, that we tend to think, that we tend to think, right? There are these cyclical patterns that arise. And how do you break cyclical patterns, particularly destructive ones? Obviously, laundry is not that big of a deal, but you can imagine a bit more disturbing thought, right? Maybe an uncomfortable, unwholesome, negative thought, judging someone, whatever, some sort of addiction. I really want this thing. I really have to have this thing. You can imagine all sorts of different thoughts you might have. Those are the best ones where you can just label it, say, huh, there's that thought again. I know them, right? It's a very difficult exercise, honestly. Even though, I am your Buddhism teacher, I can't claim any great expertise in these practices, but that really is the goal of this specific kind of meditation, is to be able to decide, right, whether you're going to follow after a thought or not. So what does this have to do with stress? Does this help with stress? Or maybe how, I mean, it claims to help with stress. Would you guys agree? Do you feel less stressful than you were 10 minutes ago? Or do you feel like, it's about the same? How are your stress levels, guys? Do you want to do what is it called? A daily tracker for your stress levels? Fill out a form. Oh, what a waste of time. So yeah, how are your stress levels? Do you feel like this helped with stress?
I think it can really help in the short term, but it's interesting. Like looking at this photo with all these people in suits.
Yeah.
It seems like a very American thing
Yeah.
to like, I have to clear my mind and meditate so I can reduce my stress, so then I can focus all my time and energy in productivity seems like these 10 minutes are aiding that when it seems like more important things might be over in the whole process of meditation itself. Does that make any sense?
That makes perfect sense, and I love it. Honestly, you're kind of predicting a critique that is out there. I teach a similar version of this lesson for my 110 class. Actually, I think Jocelyn was in that class just last semester, and we go down this route, right? We're not going to do it for this class, but basically, there's a whole world of critique where people are like, actually, you know, this mindfulness stuff, this meditation stuff, it is kind of nice, but to what end, right? Why are we meditating? Why are we learning to focus better? Is it so we can be better bees in the hive? You know, is it so when our CEO cracks the whip, we're able to do that extra hour of work at the end of the day? Because if that's the goal, then I don't really want to be a part of that, right? It's an excellent question. What are we doing this for? And of course, you know, Headspace doesn't tell you what to do it for, right? But this is how it becomes Buddhist, is then you take this tool and you apply it to a Buddhist end, right? To a Buddhist practice. What I guess maybe an open question. Brendan described, and again, for the folks in the chat who didn't hear, he described this sort of capitalist nightmare where, you know, we're taught to meditate so we can be better workers, right? So we can be more efficient, more productive. What would maybe a more Buddhist version of this activity look like?
I think more Buddhist activity to remind yourself that you're not
Uh-huh.
and put that in perspective and remind yourself that there's eternity ahead and behind you. Endlessly, that you're here for a sliver of time, floating on a rock, and then you will die one day, and that's all you can really focus on is here.
Excellent. So, so Brendan described a death meditation, right, where you focus on death. And one thing we've talked about, I keep pointing at this shadow on the blackboard as if it means something, right? But we often live in the world in one way, we experience the world in one way, but there's certain realities that are often concealed, right? Or that we just don't remember. And this was a big part of Buddhism class up until this point, right? Is remember, everything is impermanent, right? And so how can we learn to remember that things are impermanent? Meditate, right? It's not always going to be on your mind, but if you sit and meditate on the fact that you're going to die one day, if you do this every day, every morning, you will remember, and it will affect your life. It will affect the choices you make in your life. So another way to think about meditation, I think that was early on in the chapter. This word bhavana, cultivation, or literally making become. The Tibetan word is gom. Gom just means to become familiar with something, right? So like when I first went to Tibet, people would ask me, are you familiar with the food, right? Are you comfortable with the food? Can you eat the food that we eat here? Is that okay, like with your guts and all that sort of stuff? And so meditation is quite literally becoming familiar with a concept, right? Is internalizing a concept, making it a part of you. And I like this conversation because it highlights there's an openness to it. You could become familiar with what I would argue helpful things like the impermanence of life. Again, you're entering into a Buddhist world, so I'm not going to make you do that, but that's what Buddhist practitioners do think about. Or you can meditate on neutral things like your breath. That's kind of what we did, right? It's pretty neutral. We're not really getting any new ideas or anything. We're just kind of learning how to focus in the present moment, which I think there's something valuable in that, even if it is sort of a neutral exercise. Or you could meditate on kind of unwholesome things, right? Could you imagine an unwholesome meditation? A meditation that sort of might cause problems for you? What would an unwholesome meditation look like? Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm going on a bit too far of a limb here, but I would argue to a certain degree, when we are on social media, when we are on computers, when we are reading and consuming content, let's call it, it's almost like meditation, right? I was complaining a moment ago that Andy was talking too much, and he was talking a lot, right? It was basically like talk, 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 few seconds, talk, talk, few seconds, talk, talk, right? When you're really meditating by yourself, there is no Andy, right? It's just your own voice, your own head, your own thoughts. It's actually a lot harder to focus as a result. And so you could imagine it's almost like, I don't know, these brainwashing movies from the 50s or something, right? Where you listen to some voice in the background and you're meditating. All of that voice sort of enters into your life and into your mind stream. And again, if that voice is saying some negative stuff, it might take you into a bad place. If we think about this QAnon world that I was referring to before, watch enough QAnon videos, I wonder how deep it could take you, right? It's basically a giant kind of brainwashing meditation program, if you think about it. And so part of, I think, the reason why this Headspace program is I would argue becoming more and more popular is because we need it, right? Whether we want to or not, we are constantly being bombarded by messages, by thoughts, by ideas that kind of draw us in and force us to pay attention. There's a whole industry dedicated to this called advertising, right? There's a term that one of my teachers used, surveillance economy, right? Where various groups are constantly competing for our attention at all times. And it's really kind of at a premium right now, right? And so what meditation, at least purportedly, is trying to do is give you a bit of, give you a chance, right? Give you a chance to actually concentrate on something else. And as Brendan reminded us, you know, if that something else is just to get back to work, then maybe that's not so appealing. And so I'll leave it up to you. If you are interested in this sort of tool, it's worth thinking about, where do I want to put my attention? Where do I want to bring it? And that is a very important question, right? But in order to meditate, the first step is to just be able to concentrate, which is a skill in and of itself, right? And people who lack this skill, you know, are sometimes diagnosed with things like ADHD, which I'm not here to say that there's no like chemical basis to that. I think there is, but at the same time, I do think for people who don't have this diagnosis, we perhaps are somewhere on a spectrum, we could say, right? We are more or less able to concentrate, and I would argue it is a skill that we are able to develop as well. Okay, maybe that's enough. We could spend, actually we already have spent most of the class on this. We could spend more time on this if we want. Headspace, it's sort of a weird company. Maybe you can tell I'm not sure how I feel about them. I think one thing they've done very well is they have the marketing down, right? Andy has a nice voice. They have the nice videos. They got it on Netflix. I would say he's a little bit of a poser. I don't know. I saw some interviews with him where he's like, I was at a Tibetan monastery. And then somebody asked him a question. He's like, could you communicate with the monks? And he's like, not really. And I was like, well, how are you learning anything, Andy? But he is very charming. I'll give him that. So that's Headspace. That's mindfulness. Hopefully, you were able to get something out of that exercise. Just for the last 15 minutes of class, here's some more content. There are really two kinds of Buddhist meditation. Let's say two general categories, right? And then within these categories, there are a bunch of other categories. We're not going to worry about all of the details, but this is good to know. One is called calming meditation, where you're generating and maintaining a state of mental absorption or concentration. And that's basically what we were doing, right? As I said before, in order to do any sort of meditation, this is kind of the first thing you have to be able to do. You have to be able to pay attention. And as we've been discussing, the question of what you pay attention to will really decide the fate of this practice. But there's another one, insight meditation. And this is the Buddhist development, right? As I said before, people have been meditating for thousands of years, certainly hundreds of years before the life of the Buddha. This is a very old tradition. And most of what people would be doing is this calming meditation. You could imagine, right? There's no TV, there's no phone, there's maybe not even very many books, right? There's not a lot to do other than sort of work and, you know, hang out with your family and eat and hunt and grow crops and whatever. Here is something that people, if they were kind of spiritually inclined, would do, is they could sit down, meditate, focus their mind, concentrate. right? As I said, you put your awareness in different parts of your body, sort of interesting things happen. If you put your awareness on different parts of your mind, interesting things happen, right? And so developing this capacity to maintain a sustained concentration is part of the practice. And without this, you really can't do any other practice. But there's nothing distinctly Buddhist about this. Buddhists do it, but as we saw with the headspace thing, you can very easily take away that Buddhist connotation. Vipassana, insight meditation, is a little different. This is more targeted. So you go through, for example, the 5 aggregates, right? You go through some Buddhist concept like death or impermanence, right? You take a Buddhist idea. Once you're able to concentrate, then you use these Buddhist ideas, like, for example, our bodies are impermanent. And so you start thinking, what does that mean? Okay, my body's made out of parts. What parts make up my body? Well, I've got my skeleton, and you can kind of think about where my skeleton is and what's the deal with that. I've got my blood and my flesh and, all the fat and goo and grease and all the other nasty stuff. I've got my hair and my nails. And you can really begin to sort of break down the different physiological components of your body and perhaps even imagine them coming apart. I know, I don't want to disturb you guys, but you could imagine almost like, what would it be like to die, right? And this is often in Tibetan tradition expressed through the elements, your kind of physical, they call it the earth element, your more fleshy, heavy parts of your body collapse into the water element, which are the more fluid parts of your body, which then collapse into the fire element, which are the more heat parts of your body, which then collapse into, what did I skip? Space? No. Yeah, I guess it goes into air and then into consciousness. Yeah. And so by going through this process, the goal is to basically become familiar with what this feels like. So again, these are twin practices in a way, right? One is developing the capacity to concentrate, then the other is trying to do something with it, right? To develop some sort of feeling, some sort of understanding. And then once you have developed that understanding, then you can sit with it again, right? You can go back to the more concentration part. So this is the Buddhist intervention that we don't have to do as a group, but this is what makes meditation Buddhist. In terms of calming meditation, there are lots of different things you can focus on. Very common objects are an image, right? So why there's so many Buddha statues out there in the world is, well, there are many reasons for that, but one reason is people could meditate on them, right? Use a painting of a Buddha, a statue of a Buddha, something like that, and try to remember it, right? Try to imagine it in your mind. Then there are these big, complicated mandalas, which we'll talk about next class. Actually, that reminds me, I have an appointment Thursday morning. I won't be able to come to class, so I'll email you about this, but I'm gonna pre-record a lecture for next class, so we won't have to come and meet so early in the morning. You could also concentrate on a concept, like we were talking about, something like impermanence, a mantra, which is like sort of like a prayer. A very famous one is Om Mani Padme Hum, and so that's dedicated to the Bodhisattva of compassion, Guan Yin, right? We talked about Guan Yin before, Avalokiteshvara. And so you could say the special prayer to a deity and try to bring up the deity, or even an emotion, right? You could bring up a feeling of love or kindness or something like that. And you could also concentrate on the layers of the mind. So we don't have to go into too much detail about this, but here's this chart from the reading. I don't think I gave you the page. I guess it would be 88. There are these different levels of concentration states that correspond to different levels of the heavens in Buddhist cosmology, right? So again, we don't have to worry about the details, but there's this sense that if you go deeper into the layers of your mind, right, rather than just focusing on your breath, you could focus on your awareness, on your consciousness. You could focus on the depths of your consciousness and go deeper and deeper and deeper. And with that come these different trance states. So the goal is to sort of put yourself into a trance state, and not where you're like, speaking in tongues or something like that. Although I would argue it's related, right? Where you're entering deep into a place where maybe you usually do not go, right? And the argument is the deeper you go, the more the more close you become to sort of the realm of the gods. And there's a sense, if you do this very well, you'll be reborn as a god. And so you might be able to imagine this is not uniquely Buddhist, right? In fact, this is shared across really many different traditions in South Asia. Other things that get promised: extrasensory perception, clairvoyance, which is kind of an interesting term, is basically just like knowing what is happening without necessarily experiencing it, right? So extrasensory, your sense perceptions are not picking up information. You just know. I know what is happening over in that hall right now, even though I can't see it, right? You can hear distant sounds. That's called clairaudience. Recall previous lives. Know the thoughts of others. Telepathy, right? So all of these mental powers that maybe you were excited by when you were a kid, and Marvel might have something about it, like what Professor X, right? Isn't he able to do a bunch of this stuff? Say again. Doctor Strange, yeah. Actually, Doctor Strange, there is a whole hubbub about him. Like in the comic books, I don't know about the comic books, but I read about this because I'm interested in Tibet. But in the comic books, I think he had a Tibetan teacher, and then it was replaced by an English woman, right? What's her name? Swinton, something like that. In the movie. She's sort of playing the part, right? She has an English accent, yeah. It's sort of like Andy, actually. You know, what is it about English accents and meditation? I don't know. But I heard it was sort of a quiet political nod to China, basically. Like I think the Chinese government didn't want Tibetan monks running around and informing Marvel superheroes, and so they replaced the monk with an English woman. But yeah, so you know, as much as this might feel a little ridiculous, people were into this. There was a sense like, if I meditate and if I get really good at this, I will get superpowers. And a lot of scriptures, let's say, make these kinds of promises. And we're going to look at what I'm calling Buddhist magic. There's a book called Buddhist Magic where this gets taken into a great amount of detail, right? And as you know, we have a little experience meditating now. It might feel, I don't know, it might still feel ridiculous, but there are very mysterious things that happen when you meditate, right? You feel kind of weird experiences, you remember weird memories, you reach different layers of your mind, right, that you didn't necessarily know were there. So it's maybe not so far of a leap to think that something like these powers would be available to us. Now, obviously, in our society, this sort of thing is make-believe. It's not something you can take seriously, but throughout Buddhist history, people did take these things seriously. I see you're unmuted, Cameron. You want to say something?
Oh, no, sorry.
Okay. Now, that being said, Buddhists also criticize these sorts of pursuits. Now, why? Maybe I can ask you, why do you think people would criticize this sort of pursuit? Why would Buddhists have a problem with this kind of practice? Yeah, again, we come back to what we were talking about a moment ago. What's the point, right? What are we really trying to do here? Are we trying to meditate so we can become Doctor Strange and get superpowers? Or are we trying to deal with suffering, right? The Buddha is always critiquing everybody and saying, let's get back to the program here, right? Let's talk about suffering. That's really what we want to talk about. And so actually, and this is a tension within the tradition, some groups really do pursue the end of suffering. They try to achieve enlightenment. They try to achieve kind of what we've already talked about. But other groups really want to still do this sort of stuff. And maybe you can understand why. There's something very appealing about it. So this, again, it's a tension within the tradition, but to say that this is not a part of Buddhism would be just false, right? Remember the blind man and the elephant sort of thing? We can hold on to one part of Buddhism and say this is the real thing, but we would just be ignoring other parts that are very much there. All right, so just a couple more minutes. We've got insight meditation. Again, what's the goal? Is to gain insight in the nature of reality, right? We've talked a lot about karma, the links of interdependent origination. We didn't go into the details of that, but this idea that things all come together in order to create reality. We don't often experience reality this way, And in order to understand reality this way, we will have to think about it, right? We have to meditate on it. And that's what this practice is. One way you do it, and I think this is actually really key, is learning to observe. Remember, be vigilant, right? That was on your exam. Pay attention. So it's a skill. It's not something that comes out of nowhere. How do you practice? Well, this is one way to do it, is as you are meditating, you observe. You develop your ability to sort of see what's going on. Andy's labeling advice, the Headspace labeling advice, is one way to do it, right? You're observing your thoughts. So rather than getting all caught up in them, like you're in the middle of the tornado, you take a step back and like, oh, there's a tornado of thoughts. Huh, how about that, right? And so this process of learning to observe, and there's a sense like with that distance comes a greater ability to recognize and understand what's happening in you and in the world around you. So here's a list of things you could focus on: what you're experiencing, your body, physical sensations, your feeling, your mood, your mental patterns and thoughts. And whether you were recognizing it or not, that's basically what Headspace was asking you to do. Again, it's not necessarily in a Buddhist context, but he's basically saying, pay attention, right? Which to a certain degree is, flirting with this Buddhist program. And Andy does come out and say that he used to be a monk, so maybe that's not so surprising. And so in the end, I've already described this a little bit. These are used in combination, right? So you can do an analytical meditation, bring up some sort of feeling, and then try to sit with it and focus on it and concentrate on it. And then if that feeling starts to go away, then you can go back to observing and try to come up with some other idea, some other sensation, and sort of oscillate between these two. Sometimes you could think about it as sort of top down, where there's something you're trying to cultivate, maybe some sort of feeling like compassion or love or joy or something like that. But I think the more powerful ones are bottom up, right? Where you try to cultivate this feeling, cultivate this observation, try to see what is sort of bubbling under the surface, right? Because something, it's sort of a Freudian idea, but something I would argue always is. And the more you can get in there and see what's going on, I think the more effective these meditations will be. It makes me think of what Jocelyn was saying, right? We can sort of have this like, get out of here. I don't like your thoughts. Get out of here. I just got to be peaceful, peaceful, peaceful. But the more powerful, the more effective way of meditating is to notice what is happening, to see what is happening, and open up space for things to happen, right? I guess hence the name Headspace. I feel like I'm doing a commercial for them. Just try to get them to pay me. Okay, so we are out of time now. Any questions about meditation? How does that sound? So no in-person class. I guess the chat doesn't need to hear this, but yeah, I'll email and remind you. No in-person class on Thursday. I got to go to the dentist, and I will prepare something for you to watch instead of come to class. So hopefully meditation was fun.